Well, I think she will be also capable of piloting us back to our own time. After that 1 hour, and there shall be time for conversation and possibly refreshments thereafter. But a little bit background about Dr. Lydia Potts. Lydia Potts is a social scientist with specialization in migration studies as well as in gender studies. She teaches at Karl von Ossietzky University, Oldenburg in Germany. Now some background about this university, particularly the name Karl von Ossietzky. I'm told this is the name of a Nobel laureate, somebody who was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in 1935 for his contribution in peace activism as a journalist. And therefore this university was named after him. This is what I'm told. Dr. Lydia Potts has vast experience in transnational research, teaching, and curriculum development with European, Asian, and African partners. And the VETS is one of those partners. Since 2011, she is the consortium coordinator of EMMIR, the African European Erasmus Mundus master course on migration and intercultural relation. From 2012 to 2015, she directed the research project Almin, Migrant One-Parent Families in Lower Saxony in Germany. Welcome, Dr. Lydia Potts, to our keynote presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the introduction. And I would also like to thank Wicked and Melissa for this invitation and for having me at this really, I think, very important event. I would like to talk about ways how migrant women in Germany strive to overcome victimization, and I think these narratives can be considered as narratives of critical hope. During the last 2 days, I was often stunned, and I learned a lot about perspectives and approaches, about despair and hope, about meta-narratives framing them. Sometimes I was also wondering if I not only traveled in space, well, I've traveled in space from Germany to South Africa in recent days, but I felt also sometimes I was traveling in time with quite a few references, for example, to Karl Marx and Rosa Luxemburg. Both were very important for my academic work about migration, and so I thought of writing a little bit of that into the opening of my presentation this morning. It might be a bit messy altogether, but who knows. So the core of my presentation is about migrant women, namely about 3 women I would like to, in a way, portray. These 3 women are migrant mothers in Germany, and their production of hope under adverse circumstances is my topic. For some of them, residence in Germany is threatened, for all access to the labor market is difficult, and they have to fight patriarchal structures in their families and communities, as well as in German society. Before I present you with individual biographies, mothers' narratives and agencies, I would like to frame their specific positionings with a brief introduction into the global and European migration regime. So I'll travel back in time quite a bit to begin with. For me, the current global migration regime is still very much shaped by its history, and this is a history in the colonial system, in the colonial structures. Since the end of the 15th century until well into the 20th century, the colonial regimes required labor. And colonial labor regimes, basically all of them, were based on forced labor, combined with migration. The first stage, from my perspective, and I did a book about that in 1990, the first stage, the murderous, the genocidal results of colonial labor regimes led to the depopulation of the Americas. Next, the enslavement of Africans was used to fill this void, the void that was created by colonialism. Slavery was the first global system of migrant labor, long before we used this term global. It was a system based on European logistics, African people, and American workplaces. Since the early 19th century, slavery was followed and partly replaced by indentured labor, bringing the population of Asia into what might be described as the colonial world labor market. Towards the second half of the 19th century, the colonization of Africa was based on a system of forced labor, frequently combined with forced migration within the African context. Concurrently, the European industrialization was a further motor of mobilizing labor, not only in the European colonies, but also in the periphery of Europe. Last but not least, Europe produced what was then coined the Great Transatlantic Migration, reserving major part of the world for its population. North America, Australia, but also Southern Africa, establishing new societies and exporting its social question. So migration induced by Europe has shaped many, if not most or all, contemporary societies. And while all highly industrialized countries continuously need migrants for their labor markets and their welfare systems, migration is considered a threat, and migration control has moved to the top of national and global agendas. In the 21st century, the prerogative of the nation state to control its borders and to decide who is permitted to live on its territory is in constant conflict with various forms of migration, including forced migration from countries with raging wars and civil wars. So while over centuries the aim was to mobilize labor globally, once this was achieved in all continents, migration control is called for, and the restriction of migration is the key aim. So against this backdrop, the global and European migration regimes in the 21st century systematically produce institutional despair on a grand scale. Public discourse in the global north is dominated by populist voices producing fear and banking on it for all kinds of political measures and goals. Narratives of and I hate to repeat that, narratives of the rising tide of floods and waves of migrants, etc., are constantly reproduced, not least by academics. I would like to point out a few basics with regard to contemporary global migration. While there are about 250 million migrants globally at this point in time, this is a small share of the world population. It's just a little bit above 3%. And what is more important maybe is that global migration, against all the statements that we read daily in the media and where we can also find academic books about, global migration is stable since the 1960s. In each 5 year period, about 0.5% of the world population migrates, and that constantly since the 1960s. So there is not this upward movement or whatsoever that it is frequently referred to. Another important dimension is global migration is not primarily migration to the global north, but happens within world regions. Asian migrants primarily go to other Asian countries. The majority of migrants in Europe are Europeans, and African migrants are predominantly in Africa. Especially forced migration, refugees remain in the, and have to remain in the global south. Quite officially, 85% of the world's refugees live in developing countries, while the migration crisis is considered to happen in Europe. But this is not where the refugees are. So if Germany takes in 1 million migrants, that's a major crisis. If Uganda takes in a million migrants, yeah, that's sort of African daily life. Another point that I find important to stress is that migration is dangerous, but it is not dangerous for the receiving countries, it is dangerous for the migrants. The global migration routes are characterized by insecurity, abuse, and crime, and there is death tolls, some of which are known, and very many are not even known. We don't even have numbers or estimates about how many people die in the Sahara every year, and so on. There is estimates about the Mediterranean out now, so there is databases about the missing migrants, but I don't even quote these numbers now because I think they are seriously underestimated and don't give a full picture. So, and then my last point on this list, I could do many more, but just to have an overall frame, it's also important to understand that migration is a gendered process, and that there is a still ongoing feminization of migration. So in many contexts, migration is perceived as a predominantly male process. If we look at the global overall situation, it is quite safe to say that at least half of the global migrants are women, and there is migratory movements where women are the majority. There is specific gender structures at work, to some extent directed at men, to some extent directed at women. As the last section of this introduction and framing exercise, I would like to briefly refer to the situation in Germany. The situation in Germany is characterized by continuous immigration since the end of the Second World War. Immigration was needed in the labor market to prevent population decline and to sustain the welfare state continuously. I'm not going into details, that would, the time doesn't allow that. All immigration to Germany was and is controversial, namely refugee movements. The population is divided. While the brief open border policy in 2015 was welcomed by many, it also resulted in the rise of a right-wing party and an overall shift to the right in German politics. But I would argue that compared to the 1990s, when the refugee question led to pogroms and to changing the German constitution to abolish, to quite an extent, the right to asylum, there is now much more support for refugees and migrants. It is not yet clear what the overall political outcome will be. The fight is ongoing. And what is also clear, the answers can not only be found on the national level, but will also include the European dimension. And the political fight is very much entangled with that. So against this somewhat longue durée perspective and also the political economy of global migration, I would like now to turn to Beata, Fatma and Miriam and their lived experience as migrant women in Germany. So the specific context of these biographies is that we did a research project on single migrant parents in Germany, having realized that the research about single parent families in Germany was quite well developed, but more or less systematically excluded migrants. And there was also this belief that, especially with the idea about the traditional family structures in migrant communities, there wouldn't be that many, etc. So on a statistical level, it was comparatively easy to figure out, no, single-parent families are as frequent in the migrant communities as in the overall population. The pathways to that are a bit different, but overall we have about 350,000 one-parent families in Germany with a migration background. And among them are about 200,000 parents with a foreign nationality. So that's sort of the quantitative dimension. And the question we wanted to pursue with the research project was, how do migrant single parents describe and evaluate their living conditions? What are their self-perceptions, coping strategies, and also what are their needs? We did 60 qualitative biographical interviews, and I'll only introduce you to 3 of them today. In our study, we tried to reflect the diversity of the migrant population in Germany. So we had women, the majority of the migrant is a single parent families, is mother families. So we had especially women from Turkey, from various Arab states, from Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, but also from Africa and the Caribbean. The analysis we did before we approached our interviewees led us to believe that poverty would be a key topic in the interviews. The data showed that overall there is a poverty risk of 16% in the German population, so 1 in 8 people is at risk to be poor. This doubles for single parent families, and then it doubles once again if the single parents are migrants. So about 60% of single migrant families, single parent migrant families are at risk to be poor. So we expected that this would be, the poverty situation would be a core issue in the interviews, and so it came to us as a major surprise that what in very many interviews was addressed was questions of violence. And what we learned was that for very many of our interviewees, the single or mother-led family people, the key problem was experiences of violence and how to come out of a continuum of violence. I'll go into those narratives, those biographies now, and I would like to start with Beata. The leitmotif for her narrative might be the Janus phase of the European refugee regime. At the time of the interview, Beata is 30 years old and she has a teenage daughter. She was born in the DRC, in Congo, her father being Congolese and her mother Rwandan. During the Rwandan genocide, the family was living in Rwanda and both her parents were killed. Beata and her siblings fled to Congo, where a relative took care of them. And then comes a very difficult period for her and her siblings. Her brothers were recruited by a militia, or forcibly recruited by a militia. Her older sister disappeared. She stayed together with her younger sister, moved to a neighboring country, and spent 2 years in a refugee camp where she was repeatedly raped, and finally, at the age of 13, became pregnant. So after a while, she and her sister managed to escape to another neighboring country. Beata gave birth, and she was hoping for a normalization of her troubled life. But then doctors discovered that her daughter had a chronic illness and that Beata was HIV positive. So to ensure treatment for herself and her daughter, Beata decided to apply for asylum in Germany, as a relief organization had found out that her older sister, the one who had disappeared earlier, was alive and in Germany. So she got back in touch with her older sister. The older sister also helped. And eventually, Beata thought that she had a visa and a ticket to Germany. But what then turned out that somehow she had gotten the wrong plane ticket and ended up in another European country where there was no support, especially for her situation being HIV positive and for her daughter's illness. And well, with the support of her sister, she managed to get to Germany, got got medical aid, and sort of established a life. Beata, at this point, stopped her narrative and said, well, this is a very bad and sad story of me. So this is a sad story I'm talking about. And then she explained the normality of her current life. Then I take every day my medication. I have a normal life, like everyone. I wake up in the morning, I go to work, I go shopping, I eat, I have fun like everybody. But now, the very big problem is, 2 weeks ago, I received this thing, and she holds up a letter from the Bundesamt, the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees. They rejected my application. So they told me, we found out that you came from the neighboring country, and they are taking you back there. So since arriving in Germany, Beata and her daughter have experienced to some extent safety, support, and namely medical treatment. But still other wishes and needs have not been fulfilled. Beata especially talks about her difficulties to establish relationship with other people, namely with men. She's dreaming of what she calls a normal life. But she's also addressing the trauma of the pregnancy as a result of rape that also affects her relationship with her daughter. She knows I love her so much, I like her, I've been there for her all her life, and she understands me. I cannot be fine with her, is what she says, but I do my best. Yeah, and I cannot blame myself because that's how I feel. Sometimes I feel I hate myself, I hate me, I hate everything. Beata also points out that in personal or public interaction, she is addressed as a refugee, as a survivor of genocide, war, and rape, or as an HIV positive person, but never as a mother and not as a single mother. For her, the issue that she's a mother of a daughter who will never know who her biological father was is a key concern. She deliberately agreed to give the interview as an opportunity to contribute to the visibility of refugees' women's multiple traumata. I quote, "When you called me and when you asked me about my life, and I thought about this yesterday night, and I said maybe people need to know about this. People need to know about how people who get a baby from nowhere or without a father or you are not married, how they feel, how they stand, how they work it out." Beata makes use of the interview to articulate the unheard and overheard by elaborating and explaining her biography and to pass on her story. She also asked the interviewer to send the interview transcript to give it to her daughter when she is older. She's afraid that in dialogue with her daughter, she may not be able to find the right words. She believes that the document will help, and when time comes, to pass on her knowledge to her daughter. So overall, Beata's biography is characterized by a lack of protection and access to health care in various countries, in Africa, in Europe. As an asylum seeker, she has not received constant protection from the European refugee regime. The threat is that she will be deported to another European country. The permission for her and her daughter, the permission that she and her daughter can stay is at risk. She, as an adult, is not allowed to take part in the educational system, and legally she's not allowed to work, although she does it. Beata articulated her wishes as follows, quote, "To have my own work, to be busy the whole day, come back at home in the afternoon or in the evening. In the future, I would like to be busy. This is what can help me." So I would summarize this. There is still this hope to lead a regular life, and she takes a lot of steps towards that, but in the end it will depend on the legal system if that will be possible. So my second interviewee that I would like to refer to today is Fatma, and the leitmotif for her story might be escaping control and transgenerational sexual violence. Fatma is 39 years and of Turkish origin. Born in Germany, she speaks German fluently. She has 3 children, 2 teenagers with her first husband and a toddler with her second husband. Both men are Turkish nationals. Fatima lives in a flat in a German city and is working as a cleaner. Her older daughter, Sarah, at times actively participates in the interview, sitting with us in the living room along with Fatma's mother. And this will be very important for the narrative. Fatma got divorced from her first husband. She married again, and in her narrative, she primarily refers to this second husband, who came as a marriage migrant from Turkey to Germany and turned out to be despotic and controlling. Quote, "He used to control the food in the kitchen, the amount of food that was eaten, and the clothes that were bought. He controlled other dimensions," end of quote. He controlled other dimensions of Fatma's life, including her relationships with friends and family. The children were afraid of him. While Fatma was pregnant with her third child, her husband and the father of the unborn sexually abused her teenage daughter, his stepdaughter. Initially, Sarah, the daughter, was afraid to tell her mother what had happened to her. It had happened mostly during her mother's long-term hospital stays because of her critical pregnancy. After the husband attacked Sarah and threatened to kill her, she ran away, and the Jugendamt, the governmental office for children, youth and family affairs, got involved. Fatma was ordered to expel her husband from the house and to separate from him. Otherwise, the children would be taken into state care. So one could look at this as the paternalistic welfare state intervening. A week later, Fatma did as was requested. Only after the attacker had left the house, Sarah, the daughter, shared with her mother what she had gone through. Sarah's fear to inform her mother about the abuses and insults were connected with her stepfather's prohibition of intimate dialogue between mother and daughter. Sarah explained, "It was like that. When I had problems with him, I was not allowed to talk with my mother. He immediately said, 'What are you talking about?' When I had problems with him, I was not allowed to talk with her." And from Fatma's point of view, his actions were, "What are you doing there? Talking with my daughter? No, you will come right now. No, my daughter has problems and I want to talk with her. No, you will not. If she has something to say, she will do it in the living room." Only after a while I understood why he didn't want me to talk to my daughter. During the interview, Fatma repeatedly referred to the sexual abuse. "That evening, when she told me everything, the end of my world had come," she says. Sarah, the daughter, interrupts at this point in the interview. "I burst. I couldn't go on any longer. I know that it was not my fault. This is why I told her everything. I can describe how she felt this evening. Her whole body trembled. She didn't know what to do." End of quote. During the interview, Fatma and her daughter spoke with each other, negotiating between them their perceptions of what had happened to them both. At the same time, however, they shared their views and opinions with the interviewers, going beyond the private and intimate, as both were aware that parts of the anonymized interviews might be published. And just to assure you, we've changed a lot of personal details so that the interviews cannot be identified. Fatma now lives with her 3 children, and there are plans to move her mother in, and the mother was also present at the interview. Fatma is proud of herself and her children and their personal developments. Quote, "I'm proud of how I educated my children and that I chose the right way with the divorce. I have done something right and I do not regret. I'm proud that I have these children." During the interview and in the presence of her mother, Fatma admitted that her father sexually abused her when she was young and that her mother did not protect her. Fatma feels the obligation to protect her children, and this is the reason that she will never marry again, as she has promised them. So in a way, the daughter Sarah turned to the authorities opened up a process of 3-generation sexual abuse and enabled especially the mother to address the situation. And it enabled the 3-generation of women to come to terms with it. The exchange between mother and daughter is also important regarding its connections to Fatma's migration context. The public perception of Turkish family in Germany is still influenced very much by Orientalist stereotypes. In media and public opinion, the generalized perception of the majority, if not all migrant families, is that they are characterized by a backward and patriarchal system of family honor. What becomes obvious is that these women are not moving in such a universe, but are addressing gender-based violence, family violence, and it also needs to be pointed out that was what made it possible for Fatma to send her husband away, to separate, to stay with the children in the apartment, has only become possible in the year 2000, legally possible in the year 2002 in Germany. Since then we have the new law, Protection Against Violence, the Gewaltschutzgesetz, which made it possible to achieve a court order that forbids the perpetrator from entering the dwelling of the aggrieved person. In this case, it was the daughter for who this protection order was achieved. Against this backdrop, the intervening welfare state in Fatma's case did not try to uphold the conventional family model, but encouraged and supported the emergence of a mother-headed family, which paved the way for healing between Fatma and her children, but also between Fatma and her mother. But I would like really to point out these are fairly recent developments also in the German context. Since the 1970s, we have women's shelters, but here it becomes quite obvious that a women's shelter wouldn't have been the appropriate answer to this situation. So my third biography is about Miriam. Here the leitmotif might be living outside an extended family and overcoming the trauma of forced marriage and marital rape. During our interview, Miriam spoke extensively about her personal experiences with forced marriage and her current situation. She is 38 years old, of Arab origin, and lives in a German city with her extended family. She has 2 children, a boy with her former husband and a daughter with her current companion, whom she meets from time to time but does not want to live with. When she was a teenager, her family forced her to marry a friend of the family, who was twice her age. Although, or because, her voice was not listened to in the family, she decidedly resisted. Quote, "I had to do something, you know. If nobody is interested in you, you know, if you say you don't want him, you can't live with him." End of quote. So she got married, and after 1 month she escaped by committing herself to a health institution. She spent more than a month there and subsequently left her husband and broke off all contacts with her family of origin. Presently, she is back on speaking terms with her family of origin, but it remains a strained relationship. The family does not approve of her relationship with the father of her daughter, the Iraqi, as she calls him during the interview. "I did not have a lot to do with my family, and then my family didn't want to have a lot to do with me because they said either the Iraqi or us. Then I said, okay, this time I decide in favor of the Iraqi. Because before, when she was forced to marry, they did not decide in favor of me." Miriam opposes the family rules and restrictions by making her own decisions. But regarding her family, she still speaks in terms of allowing and permitting. Quote, "My parents allowed me to marry him, this new partner, the Islamic way. In German law, this is not a legally recognized marriage, so Miriam chose a rather unconventional path. She does not live together with her partner, and she is not officially or legally married to him, but for the Arab community, the religious marriage is a marriage. She desires to have a sexually active lifestyle and to be independent. Quote, "I'm just a woman. Before going to someone strange to have an intimate relationship, I don't like that. In our way, it is halal. It is not a sin, and then I also have some peace. I mean, I like it with him like that, and so why not?" Miriam can practice sexuality within a clear framework, and at the same time, she avoids marital shortcomings, burdens, and duties. Her decisions, attitudes, opinions, and lifestyle deeply affect her relationship with her family of origin. Quote, "I only speak with them superficially, only what I allow them to know. I'm not afraid, but I don't want that they make so many problems in front of my children. That's it. I'm not afraid of anyone." End of quote. So she, not only with regard to her current marriage, she combines 2 contradictory strategies, resistance and symbolic conformity. Her distancing herself from her family of origin may well be called a conscious act of undermining dominant images of proper behavior or proper female behavior in her community. Furthermore, she consciously uses secrecy to lead the life she wants. Secrecy is a big word. She goes swimming, but in another town so that the family doesn't know. Quote, my hobby has always been swimming, but since 2008 I've been wearing the headscarf. Out of love for him, you see. Stupidity, really. Yeah, I would like to also point out that the way she raises her children, she develops her very own concept and pathway. Miriam, as she describes it, gives to her children everything that she did not get when she was young. She always talks to them, so it's not about material things, but it's about interacting with the children. And she never beats them. She points out that her education practices are not like theirs. And I guess this would have to be translated as the Arab community. Other family members notice and recognize how she deals with her children, which leads to the question, does national or ethnic belonging matter when migrant mothers express their perceptions and views of motherhood and caring? Miriam clearly divides between German and Arab behavior. Quote, I deal with them like the Germans do. They have to stay in. I forbid PlayStation. That's her form of punishing the children, but not beating. This goes down well because they understand. Oh, Mama forbids the best thing. Oh, that cannot be. The son has to tidy his room, carry the garbage downstairs, clean the living room. For Miriam, this is important because, quote, with us Arabs, it's not like that a boy has to tidy his room. This is mummy's and sister's job, but not with me, end of quote. Thus, Miriam dissociates herself from the Arab community on various levels, primarily to come to terms with her former experience of violence, but on other levels, she identifies with it. Miriam elaborated on some experience with her own extended family. Quote, when I see how they talk to their mothers, I swear they don't do anything. You are women. Boys don't do things like that. They sit there, bring me this, bring me that. Her son once tried to copy this attitude. Mom, bring me water. So I went to him. Where are your feet? Where are your hands? So get up and get your water. If you are ill and you can't get up, I will be happy to serve you, but not like that. And then he noticed, oh, I can't deal with her like that. To interpret her experience, Miriam refers again to the before-mentioned binary of German and Arab, but this time adds another aspect which is linked to her lone parenting status. Quote, when he goes to his father, he can do the foreigner. There he can do what he wants, but not with me. So she is altogether also critical of the migrant community, quote, because many foreigners indeed behave badly and all are lumped together, end of quote. So Miriam has created a space for herself that allows her to dissociate from her community of origin on various levels, including the way that she cares for and educates her children. But she also identifies herself as part of this community, as also she sees herself as a foreigner, and with references to racism as well. Her message might be interpreted as a request for a perspective of diversity and intersectionality. Miriam presents herself not primarily as a victim, rather she discloses a complex biographical narration, including self-reflection, resistance, and agency, while addressing numerous contradictions and discontinuities. So for these three women, to be a single mother, to head a mother-led family has been a way out of violent constellations, and there is very clearly limitations to what they can achieve, but I would, well, my reading of these narratives was very much that they have developed an everyday practice that allows them to hope, especially for their children, and none of them is in any way romanticizing the situation or idealizing, but to be in a way head of household, to be in charge of her children, and also to quite an extent have the backup of the welfare state. Is because my last sentence is critical hope in a context of institutional despair. And so all these women materially are definitely poor by German standards at least, but nevertheless in the context they have developed agency, forms of resistance, negotiations with their communities, with their families, but also with the German society that gives them, that underlines their agency. And just to refer back very briefly to my opening part, if we look at the development of the global migration regime, the way I narrated it refers very little to migrants as subjects and migrants' agency, and I do think that direct interaction with migrants, the biographical experience, the lived experience, gives us insights into the multiple forms of agency and the way also migrants fight the system and to some extent are able to use it as resources. And that, I would claim, also refers to gendered forms of oppression and subjugation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lydia Potts, for an inspiring presentation. A presentation that indeed took us on some kind of migration ourselves. We have migrated into these three women's lives through you, and we have been able to witness and observe the kinds of challenges. You did not understate the nature of challenges that these women faced as migrants in their different migration contexts. But also, you managed to indicate that there is still hope. There is a way in which these people, the human spirit is not subdued. They are able to claim agency, be able to resist certain practices and carve spaces within which they can also, live with hope, with critical hope. Thank you very much, Dr. Potts, for this wonderful presentation. A round of applause once more for Dr. Potts. I think it is now our time to reflect, to respond to Dr. Potts' presentation by way of questions, comments, and so forth and so on. You can show by raising your hands. We'll take batches of 3 or 4, before we move on to the next. 1 at the back, 2 again at the back, 3 and 4. These are going to be the first 4 questions in that order. we can proceed.
Okay. First, thank you so much, Professor Beata, for your inspiring presentation. There's a lot of despair, but also a lot of hope. So the question regards a little bit about Germany's notorious obscure past about xenophobia. Of course, when I'm referring to this past, I'm not saying Germany's past is the worst, because the fact that those practices by the Nazi were, recorded and registered and counted and calculated and measured, we have a vast records about that. It seems sure that it's the worst, but maybe there are similar and even worse practices in other countries like Brazil and South Africa, and so many other countries in which we had slavery and other kinds of forced migration, as you mentioned. So when I talk about that, don't take like this personally. I'm talking about that event because it's the most notorious about that. So considering Germany's notorious obscure past regarding xenophobia, I tend to imagine what factors play a part of making German government have relatively more open policies towards migrants. And beyond reasons like its current economic success and political centered position by figures such as President Merkel. So what factors play a part in those policies, and how effective are those policies to protect the migrant people?
Thank you for the presentation. At one stage I was at Ruhpolding, which is not far from Munich, and from there I went to Oxford. My interest is the question of intermarriages between the Germans and these migrants, given the experiences that Boris Becker, the tennis player, went through after marrying a black woman. What is the relationship there at this stage?
Thanks very much for this rich talk. You show beautifully how these women subvert the stereotype of just being mere victims to their situation. But I'm wondering, so the classic criticism against Western feminism is that it so often takes the form of white Western women trying to save black or brown women from black or brown men. And you also say that these migrants already have the reputation in Germany of kind of coming from backward patriarchal past and backgrounds. So how do you negotiate that tension? And obviously it's important to take on patriarchy where we see it, but how do you negotiate the thing of you as a Western woman criticizing or going into the lives of non-Western people?
Thank you so much for your presentation, for sharing those narratives with us. My question is, although I understand these three narratives that you've shared with us, these three women, they experienced the violence and the conflict when they themselves were children. And I hear what they deem as crisis. So my question is, particularly because they are mothers of children, and some of those children were in these interviews, what have their children considered as crisis, and what is the hope for their children?
That's tall orders. Thank you very much. Let me answer in reverse order. What is the hope for their children? I do think, sorry, is that working? Yeah. So, what is the hope for their children? in the context of our research, we got a little bit of insight into what was going on in the families, but we did not sort of do a follow-up, and so I cannot really say, okay, now 3-4 years after we did this and that happened. But what was, in one case, was very clear that the daughter was actively engaging in the discussion with her mother, the grandmother, and the interviewers, so that the daughter also had an autonomy. And especially migrant girls in Germany, there is a lot of disadvantage, there is experiences of racism and all that, but on the other hand, the overall development is that quite a few migrant girls, having grown up in Germany, made inroads into professions, into the labor market, into also political positions and whatsoever. So I'm not downplaying, or I don't want to downplay discrimination and racism that we are still, that they are all still confronted with, but on the other hand, there is a social dynamics there. So I do think there is hope for the children as well. And so this saving black or brown women, how to negotiate. Well, in our team, we're also, in our research team, we're also migrant women, and we try to, well, how to put it, well, what I try to contextualize gender-based violence as a global problem, as a global phenomenon. And also sexual abuse in families is an overall phenomenon. It's not limited to any social strata. And well, in the papers and so on, we have details about this. And for example, there is now discourses that only about 10% of sexual abuse of children in Germany is addressed and is discovered. So when we do this, and I think that was also why the women I portrayed here, why they were able and willing to open up. We are not doing this from a perspective, this is specific to migrant families, to non-Western contexts, etc. And I've also, in this presentation, pointed out that some of the tools were just available, or just are sort of fairly new, and well, and yeah. So I do think violence, gender-based violence, is something that all women face, and that we have to also address for all women. And the question of intermarriage, I'm not familiar with Boris Becker and so on. I do think we have substantial rates of intermarriage in Germany. I haven't really studied these, but there is, and it's also to some extent quite difficult to study them, because once someone acquired German citizenship, there is no way of distinguishing what forms of marriage are happening. We don't have statistics that sort of indicate race or ethnicity or whatsoever. So overall, I would claim intermarriage is a frequent phenomenon in German society. while on the other hand, yes, German society is also still discriminating against migrants, against black people, whatever. Yeah, there is not a clear-cut answer. And then the last, or the first question, with the rampant xenophobia in Germany, how is it possible that Germany was the country that was comparatively open in the refugee crisis? Well, my claim here is that contemporary German society should not be measured or should not be looked at through the Nazi lens. In the past decades, and especially since 1968, questions of Nazi ideology have been quite thoroughly addressed in the German context. And I would say that, well, we haven't addressed colonialism on that level, and although I'm not claiming that we've come to terms with the Nazi violence, oppression, annihilation, and so on, I do think there has been lots, or there is lots of efforts, and there is quite a few results. So there is a strong, I would argue, there is a strong civil society in Germany. There is activism against racism and so on. And so I do think that contributed to this short period of open border and the welcoming that many Germans extended to the refugees. But from a political economy perspective, I'm afraid behind this was also the specific situation that Germany continuously needs immigration, and that Syrian refugees are not the worst, let me say, deal in this context, because they are coming from a comparatively secular society. They are one of the Arab countries with a relatively good education system. And Germany, the majority, or about 40% or more of the people who came from Syria into Germany were especially young men in the age group of 20 to maximum 35. So although the decision was primarily a humanitarian and maybe ethical decision, I think it was also backed and made possible by these calculations that, okay, we are in a specific situation of economic boom, and we've already realized that we need migrants, and so we might we might combine these two lines of thinking that are usually considered very separate. What we need for labor market and what is economically valuable is separate from humanitarian decisions. I've never believed these distinctions, and I do think that what happened in Germany in 2015 is just a case to show that this was a mixed decision. So, yeah, and we have still plenty of events and too many events of xenophobia, but there's also the other side, and I have the tendency to believe that that is still the majority who might be paternalistic and who might also have some feelings of superiority and so on, but that is at least blended with humanitarianism, charitable ideas, and this idea of helping and so on. So I don't want to paint a rosy picture, but overall I do think there is a situation, also after so much of immigration, that there is a situation that is fairly complex and not as binary as it often is perceived. Yeah.
Thank you. Probably because of our time, we'll just give Prof. Tiffany the last question, the opportunity to put a question across. We are really running short of time.
Is this fine? Okay. I really appreciated your paper so much. Dr. Katz was very, very, very helpful. A couple of things that you cited about the fact that the migration being talked about to Europe as if it's so unique and so distinctive, and actually the majority of the migration and even refugees are happening not in Europe. There were some things there that I've never heard in the work that I've read on migration, so I appreciated that. But one of the things that I heard, this is not so much a question as much a comment, it seems like this context also includes highly motivated migrant feminists, right, who are busy reorganizing and transforming what it means to be a migrant, what feminism is about, what feminist goals are, who is doing feminism. And given all of the kind of right-wing organizing around, like, these are not people who can participate in high-level political discussions that are quote-unquote modern ones. Actually, the cases that you described seem to me of people who are bringing like quite radical politics of egalitarianism, anti-violence, liberation from sexualized cruelty, people who can sustain individual human rights as a principle and ethic, and human rights for groups. Like particularly in Beata's story with the 3 generations insisting that they wanted to be in the same room together to tell that story. There's a lot going on politically in those things, and so when you transition from the end of the paper, you said at the beginning I gave you all the structural context, but my work is about the power of agency, the power of biography. I think one of those structural contexts, and maybe what the right wing is most afraid of, is that all of these people who are coming are not backward, but that they're whatever forward is in terms of the politics of Europe right now.
Otherwise, thank you very much, all of us, for the fantastic interventions that we have made in our responses to Dr. Potts' presentation. I hope there are some housekeeping issues. I think we break time before we then join our different panels. Thank you.
Thank you very much.